A reclusive woman's quiet life is shattered when her young neighbor Tommy shows up on her doorstep bruised and terrified, seeking refuge from an abusive home. What begins as a single night of shelter spirals into a high-stakes custody battle, forcing her to confront her own painful past while fighting to give Tommy the safe haven he's never had. Will her courage and love be enough to protect him from the forces threatening to tear them apart? And can she overcome her deepest fears to build the family she thought she'd lost forever? The steady hum of rain against the window panes turned the night into a quiet symphony, masking the distant sounds of shouting from the house next door. Grace sat curled on her worn couch, a book balanced on her knees, though she hadn't turned a page in over an hour. Her eyes flickered to the window, where the storm cast shadows like restless ghosts against the walls. Then a faint knock, not at the front door but from the side, near the porch she rarely used. Her pulse quickened. The clock's hands crept past 9, far too late for visitors. With hesitant steps, Grace approached the door, each creak of the floorboards heightening the tension in the air. When she opened it, a small, trembling figure met her gaze. Tommy, the boy from next door, stood there soaked to the bone. His jacket, 2 sizes too big, hung limply off his shoulders, and a fresh bruise darkened his cheek. His eyes, wide and glistening, searched hers with a desperation that spoke louder than words. "Miss Grace," he whispered, his voice shaking, "can I stay here, just for a little while?" Grace froze. The boy had wandered into her yard before, his laughter a rare sound of life piercing her otherwise quiet world. But this was different. The wetness in his eyes wasn't just from the rain. Something was deeply wrong. "Come inside," she said quickly, pulling the door open wider. The warmth of the house enveloped him, though he shivered still. Grace grabbed an old towel from the closet and began drying his hair, her fingers trembling as she worked. "Did something happen?" she asked softly, her voice as steady as she could manage. Tommy's gaze fell to the floor. "It's loud over there again," he said after a pause, his small fingers twisting the edge of the towel. "Real loud. And my dad, he got mad." Grace knelt, her heart squeezing. She'd seen hints before, the way Tommy flinched at sudden noises or lingered in her yard longer than a child should. She had told herself not to interfere, not to draw attention. But now, faced with the evidence in his bruised face and shaking frame, turning away wasn't an option. "Did he hurt you, Tommy?" Her voice broke slightly, but she kept her hands gentle, even as anger flared beneath her calm exterior. Tommy didn't answer right away, but his small nod was all she needed. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the house felt unbearably quiet. Grace stood, her thoughts racing. She had no children of her own, no one to call for advice. Her instincts screamed to protect him, yet the weight of what that meant left her breathless. "Let's get you dry and warm first," she said, her tone firmer now. She led him to the kitchen, where the kettle hissed on the stove, filling the space with the comforting scent of chamomile. As he sipped the tea she handed him, his trembling subsided, though his eyes remained wary. "Do you want me to call someone?" she ventured carefully. "A teacher? Or maybe someone who can help?" His head snapped up, panic flashing across his face. "No, don't tell anyone. He'll be real mad. I just wanted to stay here tonight, Miss Grace. Just tonight." Grace swallowed hard. She wanted to promise him safety, to assure him she could fix everything, but promises carried a weight she wasn't sure she could bear. For now, she did what felt right. She nodded. "All right, Tommy, just for tonight." As he settled on the couch under a pile of soft blankets, Grace sat in the armchair nearby, watching him drift off to sleep. The sight of his bruised cheek under the faint glow of the lamp filled her with a quiet rage, one she hadn't felt in years. Memories clawed at the edges of her mind, of another child, another time. She pushed them away, focusing instead on the boy before her. When the storm finally eased, the quiet that followed felt heavy with unspoken decisions. Grace knew this wasn't just for tonight. Something had to be done. For Tommy, for herself. But what came next would change everything. The dawn came reluctantly, shrouded in gray clouds that seemed to weigh heavy on the town. Grace moved through her kitchen with quiet purpose, her hands steady as she poured a bowl of cereal. Tommy sat at the small table, his legs swinging just short of the floor, his gaze fixed on the counter. His silence spoke volumes, a quiet plea for the world not to intrude. "Here you go," Grace said, setting the bowl in front of him. She hesitated before ruffling his damp curls. His face lit with a fleeting smile, but it quickly faded. "Thank you," he murmured, gripping the spoon tightly. The manners felt automatic, as though he had learned to offer them no matter how he felt inside. Grace sat across from him, her fingers laced together. She knew she needed to say something, to press for more details, but every question felt like stepping onto thin ice. Instead, she let the stillness linger, hoping he would open up on his own. Tommy finally looked up, his eyes wide and uncertain. "You're not going to tell them, are you? About me being here?" His question cut through her like a blade. "Tommy, you can't." His voice rose, panic tightening his words. "If you do, they'll take me away, or He trailed off, his breath hitching. Grace reached across the table, her hand covering his small one. "You're safe here, Tommy," she said softly. "But I can't just pretend I didn't see that bruise. I want to help you." His gaze dropped again, his small shoulders slumping. Grace watched him retreat back into himself, the armor of a frightened child coming up to shield whatever he couldn't yet trust her with. Before she could press further, a sharp knock startled them both. Grace's heart skipped as she rose from the table, Tommy's panicked expression stopping her mid-step. "Stay here," she whispered, and he nodded, his hands trembling around his spoon. Grace opened the door a crack, her chest tightening at the sight of Sarah, Tommy's mother. Her hair was hastily pulled back and her eyes darted nervously, but there was no mistaking the fury in her voice. "Grace, is Tommy here? He didn't come home last night." Grace straightened, her pulse racing. "Yes, he is. He showed up here late, in the storm. I was going to come over this morning." Sarah's expression darkened, her mouth pulling into a thin line. "He's got no business being here. You should have sent him back." "Sarah," Grace said, keeping her voice calm though her stomach churned. "He was scared, and he's hurt. I think someone needs to look into—" "Don't you dare," Sarah snapped, stepping forward. "You don't know what's going on in our house. You stay out of it, Grace." Her tone was sharp, but there was something behind it, a crack in her voice, a plea disguised as anger. Grace hesitated, considering how to respond. "Tommy's still eating," she said finally. "Come inside if you want to talk." Sarah faltered, as though the invitation had caught her off guard. "I can't," she muttered, glancing over her shoulder. "Just send him home when he's done." Before Grace could answer, Sarah turned and hurried away, disappearing down the street. Grace closed the door slowly, her mind racing. She returned to the kitchen where Tommy waited with wide, anxious eyes. "Was it her?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Grace said. "She wants you to go home." Tommy looked down at his bowl, his fingers tightening around the spoon until his knuckles turned white. "Do I have to?" The question hung between them like a stone. Grace knelt beside him, meeting his gaze. "No, you don't have to go back. Not yet. But we need to figure out what to do next." Tommy's lip trembled, and he nodded, his trust fragile but growing. Grace rose, her resolve hardening. She wasn't sure what came next either, but one thing was clear. She couldn't send him back to that house. The morning passed in tense silence, broken only by Tommy's occasional questions about Grace's books and the strange little trinkets that lined her shelves. It was a welcome distraction, though Grace's thoughts remained on the encounter with Sarah. By afternoon, she made a call to Child Services. Her voice was steady as she described the situation, though her heart pounded at every word. The woman on the other end asked pointed questions, her tone efficient but kind. Grace provided all the details she could without Tommy overhearing. "We'll send someone to investigate," the woman assured her. "In the meantime, if the boy feels safe with you, it's best to keep him there." Grace hung up, her chest heavy. She hadn't even begun to untangle her own feelings about the risks she was taking. All she knew was that she couldn't stand by while Tommy suffered. When the doorbell rang hours later, Grace's stomach dropped. The sight of two uniformed officers on her porch sent a chill through her. Tommy peeked around the corner, his face pale. "It's okay," Grace said softly, though her hands trembled as she opened the door. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm demeanor, nodded. "Miss Grace, we received a call from Sarah next door. She says her son is here and she's concerned." Grace's mouth went dry. The calm of the morning had shattered, leaving her on the edge of an unknown battle. But as Tommy's small hand slipped into hers, she felt a surge of determination. "Come in," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I think we all need to talk." Grace led the officers into the living room, her hand never leaving Tommy's. The boy hovered close to her side, his wide eyes darting nervously between the uniformed men. She guided him to sit on the couch, tucking a blanket around him before turning to face the officers. "I'm Grace," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Tommy showed up here last night, frightened and soaked from the rain. He has a bruise on his face, and he told me he didn't feel safe going home." The taller officer nodded, his gaze kind but professional. "We understand, Miss Grace. We're here to make sure Tommy's safe and to follow up on his mother's concerns." "She's concerned?" Grace couldn't keep the sharpness from her voice. "Then where was her concern when he came to my door bruised and scared?" Tommy clutched the edge of the blanket, his small body stiffening. Grace shot him a reassuring look before addressing the officers again. "I've already contacted Child Services. I'm not sending him back to a situation where he might be harmed." The second officer, a younger woman with a soft tone, stepped forward. "Miss Grace, we understand your position, but the law is clear. Unless there's immediate danger, a child has to remain with their legal guardian until an investigation determines otherwise." Grace's stomach turned. She knelt in front of Tommy, her voice dropping to a gentle murmur. "Tommy, would you be okay answering a few questions? You don't have to if you're not ready." Tommy glanced between her and the officers, his lips pressing together tightly. After a long moment, he gave a small nod. The officers moved to sit on the other side of the room, their posture relaxed but attentive. The younger one spoke first. "Tommy, can you tell us about what happened last night?" Tommy hesitated, his fingers twisting the blanket. "It was real loud again," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad got mad. He was yelling at Mom, and then he started yelling at me." "Did he hit you?" the officer asked gently. Tommy didn't respond, but his hand moved instinctively to his cheek, brushing the bruise. The movement said more than words ever could. The older officer leaned forward slightly. "Tommy, it's really important we understand everything. Did you feel like you couldn't stay at home anymore?" Tommy nodded, tears pooling in his eyes. "I just wanted to go somewhere quiet." Grace's chest ached at the raw honesty in his voice. She reached out and placed a hand on his knee. "You did the right thing by coming here, Tommy," she said softly. The officers exchanged a glance before standing. The younger one offered Grace a small smile. "We'll file this as part of the report. For now, we'll let Child Services take the lead." As they left, Grace felt a mix of relief and dread. She had bought a little time, but she knew the battle was just beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Tommy remained at Grace's house, and though he seemed to relax in the safety of her quiet home, the shadows of his fear lingered. He followed Grace from room to room, hesitant to let her out of his sight. One afternoon, as Grace was folding laundry, Tommy perched on the edge of her bed, his voice small. "Why do you live alone, Miss Grace?" The question caught her off guard. She paused, the soft fabric slipping from her hand. "I like the quiet," she said after a moment. "But it wasn't always this way." Tommy tilted his head, his curiosity cutting through his usual reserve. "Did you have a family before?" Grace hesitated. The memories she had spent years burying began to surface. She sat beside Tommy, her fingers twisting the hem of the towel she held. "I did," she admitted. "I had a daughter once. Her name was Lily." Tommy's eyes widened. "What happened?" The words stuck in her throat. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to continue. "There was a time when I couldn't take care of her the way I should have. I tried, but it wasn't enough. She went to live with her father." Tommy studied her with the quiet wisdom children often had. "Do you see her now?" Grace shook her head, her chest tightening. "Not anymore, but I think about her every day." For a moment, silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then Tommy reached out, his small hand resting on hers. "I'm sorry, Miss Grace." Grace smiled faintly, her eyes stinging. "Thank you, Tommy. That means a lot." The fragile peace they had built was shattered 2 days later when a notice arrived. A hearing had been scheduled. Sarah and her husband were contesting Grace's actions, claiming she had interfered with their family. The words burned in her mind, a cruel twist of reality. Her neighbor, Mrs. Andrews, came by that afternoon, carrying a casserole dish and a worried expression. "Grace, I heard about the hearing. What can I do to help?" Grace hesitated. She had always kept to herself, reluctant to burden others. But now, with Tommy's future at stake, she couldn't afford pride. "If you could tell the court what you've seen, how often he's come over here, that might help." Mrs. Andrews nodded firmly. "Of course. I've seen that boy playing in your yard more times than I can count. You can count on me." As she left, Grace turned to find Tommy watching from the hallway. "What's going to happen, Miss Grace?" he asked, his voice trembling. Grace knelt before him, her hands resting on his small shoulders. "We're going to fight this, Tommy. I don't know what will happen, but I promise you, you won't face it alone." The words felt heavy, a promise that terrified her as much as it reassured him. But as Tommy leaned into her embrace, Grace felt a quiet strength rising within her. She had lost one battle in her past, but this time, she wouldn't back down. The day of the hearing dawned cold and gray, the sky heavy with unfallen rain. Grace paced her small living room, the wooden floor creaking under her feet. Tommy sat on the couch, clutching a small stuffed bear Grace had given him the night before. The bear's frayed ear and missing button eye mirrored the fragile courage Grace felt as she tried to steady her breath. "You don't have to go, Tommy," she said for the third time. "It's just a preliminary hearing. The judge will hear both sides, and then they'll decide what to do next." Tommy shook his head, his knuckles whitening around the bear. "I want to go," he said firmly. "I need to tell them." Grace's heart ached at his determination, so much braver than any child his age should have to be. She crouched in front of him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "You're very brave, Tommy. But remember, it's okay to be scared too." He nodded, his lip quivering, and Grace pulled him into a hug. The faint scent of his shampoo, grape, and bubblegum filled her senses, grounding her in the moment. The courthouse loomed before them, its gray stone facade imposing against the dreary sky. Inside, the air buzzed with low murmurs, a mix of bureaucratic routine and human drama unfolding in whispered tone. Grace spotted Sarah and her husband, Nathan, seated at a bench near the front of the courtroom. Sarah's gaze darted toward Grace, her eyes narrowing, but Nathan didn't even look up. His massive frame seemed to radiate a quiet, dangerous tension, like a thundercloud ready to break. As they took their seats, Grace felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Mrs. Andrews, dressed in her Sunday best, her warm smile a small comfort. "I'm here for you," Mrs. Andrews whispered. "And for that sweet boy." Grace nodded, gratitude tightening her throat. "Thank you." The hearing began with procedural formalities. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, calling the room to order. Sarah's lawyer, a man with a polished suit and an air of practiced indifference, spoke first, painting a picture of a misguided neighbor interfering in a family's private matters. Grace's stomach churned as he described her as overstepping her bounds and escalating a situation that required family counseling, not meddling. His words felt like blows, each one striking at her resolve. When it was her turn to speak, Grace stood, her knees trembling. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear despite the nervous tremor beneath it, "I didn't meddle. I acted to protect a child who came to my door bruised, frightened, and asking for help." She turned, her eyes finding Tommy's in the crowd. He sat beside Mrs. Andrews, clutching his bear, his gaze steady and unwavering. His courage bolstered her. "I contacted Child Services because I believed and still believe that Tommy is in danger," she continued. "No child should have to endure what I've seen in his eyes, fear, exhaustion, and hopelessness. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Her words hung in the air, met with silence before the judge nodded for her to sit. The most harrowing part of the hearing came when Tommy was called to speak. Grace's heart felt like it would break as he shuffled to the witness stand, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing chair. "Tommy," the judge said, her tone gentler now, "can you tell me why you went to Miss Grace's house that night?" Tommy's hands twisted the bear's ear as he answered, his voice barely a whisper. "It was loud at home. My dad was yelling a lot, and he hit me." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Grace saw Sarah flinch, her hand flying to her mouth. Nathan, however, remained stoic, his jaw tight. "Do you feel safe at home?" the judge pressed gently. Tommy hesitated, then shook his head. "I feel safe with Miss Grace." The courtroom was silent for a long moment. Grace's eyes blurred with unshed tears as Tommy stepped down, his small shoulders set with a bravery that left the room breathless. The judge adjourned the hearing without a decision, stating that further investigation was needed. Grace left the courtroom feeling both relieved and anxious. The battle wasn't over, but for now, Tommy would stay with her. Outside, Sarah approached them, her face pale and drawn. "Grace," she began, her voice trembling. "I didn't know—" Her words faltered, her gaze dropping to Tommy, who pressed closer to Grace's side. Grace met her with a steady gaze. "You knew, Sarah. Maybe not all of it, but enough, and you still let it happen." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, and for a moment, Grace saw the woman she might have been before Nathan's anger swallowed their home. But sympathy had limits. Grace placed a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder and walked away without another word. That night, as Tommy slept curled up on the couch, Grace sat by the window, staring out at the darkened street. Her mind churned with questions she couldn't yet answer. How far would Nathan go to keep control of his family? Could she truly protect Tommy from a system that so often failed children like him? But then she thought of Tommy's words in the courtroom. "I feel safe with Miss Grace." The memory brought a flicker of warmth to her chest. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't stop fighting for him. Not now. Not ever. The knock on Grace's door came late one evening, the kind of knock that carried weight even before the door was opened. Grace, seated at the kitchen table, froze mid-sip of her tea. Tommy, playing with a deck of cards on the living room floor, looked up, his eyes widening. "Stay here," Grace murmured, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She rose and crossed the small space to the door, bracing herself. When she opened it, Nathan stood on her porch. His towering frame blocked out the faint glow of the porch light, his presence oppressive and menacing. His face was shadowed, but Grace could see the tension in his clenched jaw, the barely contained fury simmering beneath his controlled demeanor. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but laced with steel. Grace didn't step back, didn't open the door wider. She gripped the edge of the door frame until her knuckles turned white. "Whatever you have to say can be said from right there." Nathan's mouth twitched in what might have been a smirk, if not for the anger behind it. "You've taken things too far, Grace. Calling the cops, dragging my family's name through the mud in court. You're ruining us." "You've done that yourself, Nathan," Grace said, her voice sharp, unwavering. "Tommy isn't safe with you, and you know it." He stepped closer, his tone dropping to a dangerous growl. "You don't know anything about my family. He's my son, not yours." Grace felt her stomach twist, fear creeping into her resolve. She knew Nathan was dangerous. Tommy's bruises were proof enough, but she held her ground. "Tommy came to me because he was afraid of you. That's all I need to know." Nathan leaned in, his voice cold and deliberate. "You think you're helping him? You're just filling his head with lies, making him think he doesn't belong with his family. You're going to regret this, Grace." Before she could respond, he turned and stalked off into the night. Grace closed the door slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Tommy's wide eyes met hers as she turned around. "Was it him?" he asked, his voice small. Grace crossed the room and knelt in front of him. "Yes, but he's gone now. You don't have to worry. I won't let him hurt you." Tommy nodded, but the fear in his eyes lingered. The tension in the days that followed was palpable. Grace's phone buzzed with messages and calls from Sarah, some pleading, others angry. Each time she let the phone ring unanswered. The hearing had been rescheduled for later in the month, and the weight of the waiting gnawed at Grace's nerves. Then, one afternoon, as she was working in the garden while Tommy played with Mrs. Andrews's cat nearby, she noticed a car idling at the corner of her street. It wasn't a car she recognized, and its presence unsettled her. She led Tommy inside, locking the door behind them. Over dinner, she kept her tone light, asking him about his favorite foods and what he wanted to do when things settled down. But her mind remained on the car, the shadowy presence that felt too close for comfort. That night, Grace woke to the sound of glass shattering. For a moment, she thought it was a dream, the kind born from her overactive fears. But when she sat up, the sound of hurried footsteps confirmed the truth. She rushed to the living room to find the front window shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. Tommy stood in the hallway, his face pale with terror. "Miss Grace!" he cried, rushing to her side. She pulled him close, her heart racing. Outside, a figure darted into the shadows, disappearing before she could make out any details. Grace called the police, her hands trembling as she explained the situation. When the officers arrived, they confirmed her worst fear. It was likely someone trying to send a message. "Do you think it was Nathan?" one officer asked as he surveyed the damage. Grace hesitated. She couldn't say for certain, but in her gut she knew. "I can't prove it," she said quietly, "but I wouldn't be surprised." The officers promised to patrol the neighborhood, but Grace knew the message had already been delivered. She wasn't safe. Neither was Tommy. The breaking point came 2 days later when Grace received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a court summons. Nathan and Sarah were filing for emergency custody of Tommy, claiming that Grace was a danger to him and had kidnapped him under false pretenses. Grace read the letter 3 times, each word sinking like a stone in her chest. She had feared this, but seeing it in black and white made the fight ahead feel insurmountable. As she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the summons, Tommy wandered in. "Miss Grace?" he asked, his voice soft. "Are you okay?" She looked up, her eyes meeting his. His small face was etched with worry, a reflection of the battles he had already fought in his young life. Grace took a deep breath and reached for his hand. "We're going to fight this, Tommy," she said, her voice steady. "But I need you to be brave, just like you've been this whole time." Tommy nodded, his grip tightening on hers. "I can do that." Grace smiled faintly, though her heart was heavy. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. But as she looked at Tommy, she felt a flicker of hope. They had come this far together, and together they would face whatever came next. The courtroom was packed. The sterile air seemed to carry the tension of every whispered conversation and every sharp glance exchanged between lawyers and families. Grace sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, Tommy beside her. His presence was her anchor, but his nervous fidgeting, the way his small fingers kept brushing the frayed edge of his sweater, revealed the weight he was carrying. Across the aisle, Nathan and Sarah sat stiffly, their lawyer already deep in discussion with the judge. Nathan's gaze burned into Grace, his jaw tight with simmering anger. Sarah looked away whenever Grace met her eyes, guilt flickering in her expression like a candle struggling to stay lit. The proceedings began with the plaintiff's lawyer presenting their case. He painted Grace as a well-meaning but delusional neighbor, interfering in family matters where she had no right. "This is not about Miss Grace's character," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. "It's about a child being removed from his rightful home. A family may have challenges, but those challenges are for the parents to address, not a neighbor overstepping her bounds." Grace's lawyer, Mr. Harris, leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. We'll counter every point." When it was Grace's turn to speak, she stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hand. She addressed the judge directly, her voice clear but thick with emotion. "Your Honor, I didn't ask for this. Tommy came to me, frightened and hurt. I did what I believe any decent person would do. I gave him a safe place to stay and reported my concerns. I've spent these weeks seeing the scars this situation has left on him, physical and emotional, and I can't stand by and let him be hurt again." She glanced at Tommy, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair beside her, and drew strength from the way he looked back at her, trusting and hopeful. The judge nodded. "Thank you, Miss Grace. Now, I'd like to hear from Tommy." The room seemed to hold its breath as Tommy approached the witness stand. He climbed into the chair with effort, clutching his stuffed bear tightly. The judge's expression softened as she addressed him. "Tommy, I know this is hard," she said, her tone warm and encouraging. "But I need you to tell me the truth. Do you feel safe at home with your parents?" Tommy hesitated, his small hands trembling as he smoothed the bear's fur. His eyes darted to Nathan, who was glaring at him, then to Grace, whose reassuring smile gave him the courage to speak. "No," he said, his voice a whisper. The judge leaned closer. "Can you tell me why?" Tommy's lip quivered, but he pressed on. "Dad yells a lot. He hits sometimes. Mom tries to stop him, but she can't. I don't like being there." Nathan muttered something under his breath, prompting a sharp glare from the judge. "Mr. Moreno, one more outburst, and I will have you removed from this courtroom." Tommy continued, his voice growing stronger. "Miss Grace takes care of me. She makes me feel safe. I don't have to be scared with her." Tommy's words sent ripples through the courtroom, and the tension between Nathan and Sarah became palpable. Nathan leaned toward her, whispering something harsh. Sarah's face crumpled, tears streaking her cheeks. When Sarah took the stand, her testimony stunned the courtroom. She admitted what Grace had long suspected, that she had been too afraid of Nathan to protect Tommy. Her voice broke as she recounted years of intimidation and manipulation. "I knew what was happening was wrong," she said, her hands clutching the edge of the stand. "But I didn't know how to stop it. I was scared. For myself, for Tommy. But I can't keep pretending anymore." Nathan shot to his feet, his face red with fury. "Sarah, don't you dare!" The judge banged her gavel. "Mr. Moreno, sit down immediately or I will hold you in contempt." Sarah continued, her voice trembling but resolute. "I don't want Tommy to go back to that house. If it's between me and Grace, I want him to be with Grace." Nathan's outburst confirmed what everyone in the room already knew. The judge ordered him removed, his angry protests echoing down the hallway as the bailiff escorted him out. The proceedings stretched into the late afternoon, each side presenting arguments and witnesses. Mrs. Andrews testified on Grace's behalf, her steady voice recounting the many times she had seen Tommy wandering into Grace's yard, looking for solace. "He wasn't just playing," she said firmly. "He was escaping. I saw it, and I didn't do enough to stop it. But Grace did." By the time the judge called for a recess to deliberate, the room was charged with anticipation. Grace sat in silence, her heart pounding as she gripped Tommy's hand. He leaned into her side, his small body trembling. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, though she didn't know if it was true. When the judge returned, the room fell silent. She began by acknowledging the complexity of the case, the weight of the decisions being made. "This is not an easy matter," she said, "but my priority is the safety and well-being of the child." Her gaze swept the room before landing on Grace. "Miss Grace, your actions demonstrate a deep care and commitment to Tommy's welfare. I am granting you temporary custody while Child Services continues their investigation into the Moreno household." The words washed over Grace like a wave, relief and disbelief mingling in her chest. Tommy clung to her arm, tears streaming down his face. "You did it, Miss Grace," he whispered. "We did it," she corrected, pulling him into a tight embrace. As the courtroom emptied, Grace felt a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. This wasn't the end. There would be more hearings, more challenges ahead. But for now, Tommy was safe, and that was all that mattered. The days following the court's decision brought a fragile calm to Grace's home. The constant knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen, though the shadow of what lay ahead lingered. She took small, careful steps to create a sense of normalcy for Tommy, a routine that offered stability and safety. Each morning started with breakfast at the kitchen table, where Tommy would talk more openly about his favorite cartoons or his dreams of becoming an astronaut. Grace would listen with a smile, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She had learned to cherish these simple moments, reminders of the resilience children carried even in the face of adversity. One evening, as they sat on the couch with a book, Tommy set it aside and looked at Grace with a seriousness that didn't match his years. "Miss Grace," he began hesitantly, "do you think my dad is going to come back?" Grace froze, her hands resting on her lap. She had asked herself the same question countless times. "I don't know, Tommy," she admitted softly, "but no matter what happens, I'll do everything I can to keep you safe." Tommy nodded, his small hand creeping into hers. "I like it here," he said after a pause. "It feels like home." His words struck a chord deep within her. She squeezed his hand, her voice catching as she replied, "I like having you here too, Tommy." The weeks passed with fewer disruptions than Grace expected. Nathan remained out of sight, though his absence carried an unspoken tension. Sarah, on the other hand, surprised Grace by reaching out. It started with small gestures, dropping off a toy Tommy had left behind, asking how he was adjusting, but grew into longer conversations. "I want to make things right," Sarah admitted one day as they sat on Grace's porch. Her hands trembled around the mug of tea Grace had handed her. "I don't know how to fix everything, but I know Tommy deserves better." Grace studied her carefully, sensing the sincerity in her words. "It's not too late, Sarah," she said gently, "but it's going to take time." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening. "I just want him to be happy." Child Services conducted a series of evaluations over the following weeks, visiting Grace's home and interviewing Tommy. Each visit left her on edge, worried that she might fall short of their expectations. But every time Tommy spoke about feeling safe and loved, her confidence grew. One day, the social worker, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Patel, sat down with Grace after her final evaluation. "You've done an incredible job, Miss Grace," she said, her tone warm but professional. "It's clear that Tommy thrives here." Grace felt a rush of relief but stayed cautious. "What happens next?" Ms. Patel smiled faintly. "The court will decide soon, but I believe your custody arrangement has a strong foundation. You've given Tommy something he's never had before: stability." Her words stayed with Grace long after she left. Stability. It seemed like such a simple thing, yet it was the cornerstone of everything she had fought to build for Tommy. When the final court date arrived, the tension was almost unbearable. Tommy clung to Grace's hand as they entered the courtroom, his small frame trembling despite the brave face he tried to put on. Sarah was there, looking more composed than Grace had seen her before. She nodded at Grace, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken truce they had reached. The judge's decision came quickly this time. After recounting the evidence and evaluations, she delivered her verdict. "Based on the findings of Child Services and the testimony provided, I am granting Grace permanent custody of Tommy Moreno. This decision reflects what is in the best interest of the child, ensuring his safety and well-being." The words rang in Grace's ears, their weight sinking in slowly. Tommy let out a small gasp, his hand tightening around hers. "It's official?" he whispered, his voice filled with hope. Grace knelt down, tears streaming down her face. "It's official," she said, her voice breaking. Tommy flung his arms around her neck, his small body trembling with relief and joy. Grace held him tightly, her heart fuller than it had been in years. That evening, as they sat by the fire with mugs of cocoa, Tommy looked up at Grace, his eyes bright. "Does this mean I can stay forever?" Grace smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "Forever and ever, Tommy." The boy grinned, a lightness in his expression that Grace hadn't seen before. For the first time, she felt the weight of her own past lift, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were a family. The house had never felt more alive. Laughter echoed through the small rooms, filling the quiet spaces that had once been marked by solitude. Grace stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup, while Tommy darted in and out of the kitchen, chasing Mrs. Andrews's mischievous cat, who had become a frequent visitor. The boy's giggles were infectious, a sound Grace had come to treasure. "Careful, Tommy," she called, glancing over her shoulder. "You don't want to trip over—" Her warning was too late. Tommy tumbled into the chair by the table, the cat leaping to safety. He sat up with a sheepish grin, holding up the wooden spoon he had been wielding like a knight's sword. "I'm okay," he declared, his face flushed with excitement. Grace chuckled, shaking her head. "Just don't let that cat fool you. She's sneakier than she looks." Tommy nodded seriously, as though accepting a great challenge. Grace watched him run off again, her heart swelling. It was in these little moments, the mundane joys of their new life together, that she saw just how far they had come. Later that evening, after dinner was cleared and the dishes were drying in the rack, Grace brought out an old, battered photo album. Tommy sat beside her on the couch, his curiosity piqued. "What's that?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. Grace smiled, flipping open the cover. "Memories," she said softly. The pages were filled with faded photographs of her life before Tommy, A young Grace holding a baby girl, family gatherings in sunlit backyards, and holiday snapshots that seemed to belong to another lifetime. "Who's that?" Tommy pointed to a picture of the little girl with pigtails, her face lit with laughter. "That's Lily," Grace said, her voice tinged with both sadness and warmth. "My daughter." Tommy studied the photo, then looked up at Grace. "Do you miss her?" "Every day," Grace admitted. "But I think she'd be happy to know I'm taking care of you now." Tommy leaned against her, his small hand resting on her arm. "I think you're really good at it." The simplicity of his words, spoken with the pure honesty only a child could muster, brought tears to Grace's eyes. She pressed a kiss to the top of his head. "Thank you, Tommy. That means everything." As the days turned into weeks, their lives settled into a rhythm. Grace enrolled Tommy in a local school, where he quickly became the boy with the brightest smile and the biggest heart. At night, he would tell her stories about his classmates and the adventures they had on the playground. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Tommy looked up from his homework and asked a question that stopped Grace in her tracks. "Miss Grace, do you think I can call you Mom?" The room fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Grace felt her breath catch, her heart swelling to the point of breaking. She turned to Tommy, his wide eyes full of hope and vulnerability. "You can call me whatever you want, Tommy," she said softly. "But if you want to call me Mom, I'd be honored." Tommy beamed, his grin stretching ear to ear. "Okay, Mom," he said, testing the word as if it were a gift he'd just unwrapped. Grace pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as tears spilled down her cheeks. It wasn't just a name, it was a bond, a promise, and a beginning. That night, after Tommy had fallen asleep, Grace stood at the window, gazing out at the quiet street. The world outside still held its uncertainties, but her home, their home, was a place of safety, love, and hope. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined her. And as for Tommy, his resilience had transformed her, reminding her that even the most broken hearts could find a way to heal. The moonlight cast a soft glow over the room as Grace whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for the boy who had come to her doorstep bruised and afraid, for the second chance to be the kind of parent she had always wanted to be, and for the family they had built together. One laugh, one hug, and one memory at a time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she let herself savor the quiet joy of the present. Tommy was safe. She was at peace. And together, they were finally home. Thank you for being here today. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories and share your thoughts in the comments. What moment resonated with you the most? We'd love to hear your reflections and stories. Your voice makes our community stronger.